There's a large and growing body of research on what professors can do to help all students learn, but it isn't always put into practice. Most professors weren't really taught how to teach, and their institutions don't always recognize, reward, or support good teaching either. I'm Becky Supiano, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Kathy N. Davidson and Christina Katapodis, the authors of The New College Classroom, for a conversation about what can happen when the evidence on effective teaching is put into action. Hi, Kathy and Christina. Really glad to have you here today.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. It's an honor to be here.
Hi, I'm here. Very great. There I am.
Hi,
it's great to be here.
Good to see you both. We don't have a ton of time, so let's go ahead and dive in. One thing I hear from professors all the time is that no one really taught them how to teach. Early on in the book, you write, because we have inherited certain educational traditions, does not mean that we as instructors have to perpetuate them. I imagine some readers find that idea really freeing, while others might find it kind of threatening. What traditions are you encouraging them to shuck off exactly?
Well, it's one of them we have to shuck off is the idea that's implicit and explicit in college education, in the way teachers are trained, that everybody's going to get a PhD. We teach very specialized courses. We ourselves are trained as researchers in specialized area. Only 3.5% of students who graduate from college go on to a PhD. So part of it is a paradigm shift where we have to think higher than we're thinking now and actually evaluate ourselves and appreciate ourselves more for all the life skills that come along with many of the specialized skills in researching and studying for an exam and professionalization that we do in our classrooms.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to build off of what was said earlier, the tradition that Kathy talks about also, and we mentioned in the book about training factory workers and training students for industry. To build off of the earlier session, I think we're also training students using active learning to break away from that kind of model, the Model T of education, basically to transform industry, to transform careers, to get out and train them for being citizens of the world and to also change the world, right? To change the gig economy, to advocate for themselves and make the world a better place. So it's a both and, but with an emphasis on transforming education so that it's more active and engaged, flowing and moving in a different direction.
Thanks. Let's talk about what's at stake here. What would happen if professors just keep on teaching the same way they always have?
Well, the same thing that's been happening for years, which is you're replicating yourself. About 1% of the US population has a PhD. 25% of the parents of college professors have PhDs. So we are a profession that tends to replicate itself. We also know those students that raise their hand in class are most like the professors. So if we have a professorate that's largely white, middle class, well-educated in upbringing, those are the students we're likely to see as excellent students and reward. So if we want a more diverse workforce, if we really want, and Christine and I are fortunate to teach at CUNY, which is one of the #1 schools in the country for social mobility. If you really believe in social mobility, you have to have a way that students have agency, not just replicating the careers, the life, the form of learning that their professors have.
And I mean, and speaking of agency, Susan Engel, she's a developmental psychologist, talks about this study where children have an innate curiosity about the world. They want to ask how and why, and anyone with a toddler knows that they're constantly asking questions, right? When they go to school, they go from asking 27 questions an hour, maybe more if you have a 3-year-old like I do, to asking 3 an hour. So they're asking significantly fewer questions in school. That means they're not challenging the status quo, right? And so we have these years of schooling in K through 12 and higher ed. And if you're not asking more questions, asking how and why something works, then you're not ready to make changes. You're ready to follow what was done before. And so if we can transform our classrooms and the way we teach, the model that we're using, so that students have more agency, like Kathy mentioned, and more room to ask questions and to take the lead, then we're training leaders, entrepreneurs, people who are ready to be original thinkers, creative and critical thinkers.
Thanks. You're encouraging professors to use active participatory teaching approaches. Could you talk about a few examples of the sorts of things you mean for the uninitiated?
Sure. First of all, another little factoid. We've been talking about active learning since Montessori and Dewey in the early 20th century. And Nobel Prize winner Carl Wyman likes to say that we have over 1,000 studies now about the efficacy of active learning. In one study that came out in 2014, it's a meta study of 225 separate studies, in the publications of the National Academies of Science. The author said, if this were a pharmaceutical study, traditional learning would be taken off the market. Active learning is the way we learn pretty much everything outside of school. If I'm learning tennis, I don't learn by listening to a lecture, I learn by practicing. If I miss the ball, then someone might correct me, but then I try again. And the methods that Christina and I have studied from thousands of educators around the world and are amplifying in our book are all tested methods, easy methods to use, but that go on that commonsensical principle that you learn by doing, you learn by understanding, you learn by taking an idea and thinking it through and applying it elsewhere, you learn by communicating. Christine, I'm sure can tell about some specifics of how you do that, but it's not that hard. We just have to change our paradigm first. And that's why we begin the book with changing ourselves, even before we get to changing our classrooms.
Yeah, happy to talk about some specific examples. I know that Think, Pair, Share is a big one that Kathy starts every talk with, where students or participants in a session. We've done this at conferences. She's done this with a whole stadium full of people. And so, in the beginning, you ask a question and you take a moment to think. Everyone writes down their answer, which helps to avoid groupthink, where the first person to raise their hand sets the whole tone of the conversation. If everyone writes down their answer simultaneously, then they're all putting down something original, something that's really theirs. And then they pair up with someone next to them and talk to them for a moment about their answers, and then they can share back with the larger group. You can do this as an entry ticket where people walk in and answer a single question, or an exit ticket. Jonathan Stern does this with hundreds of media studies students, which is amazing. And he has them answer an exit ticket at the end of every class where they say, what thing is going to keep you up at night that we learned about today? Or like, what burning questions do you still have after today's session? And if there isn't something we talked about that's going to keep you up at night, what should we be talking about instead? And I love that. A couple other quick ones are to look at the learning outcomes on your syllabus and ask students to create their own individual learning goal, or a collective one together as a class, and add that to the syllabus and ask them at the end of the semester, how close did we get to reaching your learning goal? And that's a student-centered one, right? The last I'll mention is asking students to come up with questions for the final exam. In a class where you're multiple choice tests, A, B, C, D, ask students to get into groups and come up with a valid question for the final exam. How they arrived at that question, what skills it's evaluating, what are the wrong answers, why are they wrong, what's the right answer, why is it right, what are some different ways to get to the right answer. And at the end, you could select several of their questions and incorporate them into the final exam.
If I can just build on what Christina said, the cool thing about having students actually contribute to a final exam is that's the process that employers say is crucial to what they're looking for in future employees. There's a wonderful association called the National Association of Colleges and Employers that have interviewed thousands of employers about what they want most: critical thinking and problem solving, professionalism, communication skills. Having the right answer on a final isn't it. People forget the content answer very quickly unless they use it. but the life lesson that goes into thinking, how would you write an exam question? And how would you write the wrong answer? And a multiple choice, one of the challenges is writing good wrong answers, right? What makes the difference between a right and wrong answer? You've then taken a passive kind of learning, right? A high stakes final exam that you study for. And we know we've got studies going back to the 1880s on this. You forget 75% of what you learn on a final exam within weeks after the exam, unless you're using it. If it's not content you use, it's gone. And that's true for everybody. That's just how we know that. We've all experienced that. But if you've actually tried to think about what goes into a good question and what goes into a good trick question, you're learning a life skill, especially if you're talking about that with others, that you can have in your hip pocket, like think, pair, share for the rest of your career.
Thank you both. I think more and more professors are getting on board with the idea of inclusive teaching, but there was this recent controversy about the organic chemistry instructor at NYU. And one of the things that I think is resurfaced in the wake of that is that there are many other instructors who don't think it's their job to help everyone succeed, don't think everyone is cut out for success in their discipline or in their course, and think that's really on the student and not on the professor. I wonder what you would say to instructors who view things that way.
Well, I'm going to just jump in because I have a job and it's safer for me to say this. I looked briefly at that, and very quickly we got into a second generation of controversy that wasn't about the original case at all, but people saying, I believe in rigor, I don't believe in rigor, and without a lot of knowledge and background. The little I could read firsthand that seemed to be really about what the professor was doing, it was like, wow, that's not who I'd want my kid to be learning organic chemistry from. That's not who I'd want my best college student to be learning from. It was a very one-directional kind of teaching that didn't seem really about learning, but about test taking. And if I were a student, I might well complain and say, I want to be the best doctor in the world. So I want to learn how to think like a doctor. I don't want to learn from somebody who's already got a PhD in organic chemistry and is retired and now coming back as an adjunct to make a few bucks and teach me. I want to learn how you think like a chemist. I want to really be a chemist. I'm not less rigorous, I'm more rigorous. I want higher standards for what I'm learning in this class. Again, I can't even keep that story straight anymore. It's gone into so many generations of everybody having an opinion that I'm not talking really about that specific case anymore. But the whole idea of what we are doing in a classroom, it has to be much more than preparing students for a final exam where they're going to forget the content unless they happen to be using it in their lives within weeks after the exam. Again, we have the research that goes back to the 1880s. Carl Wyman, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, is so frustrated. He says, we have the research. Why aren't we changing? We know what's a good way to learn. It's how we learn everywhere except in school.
I would just add to that when colleagues have asked me, like, but aren't you the expert in the room? Aren't you supposed to be the expert in the room, right? I just tell them about what a beautiful intellectual challenge it is to ask students what they want to learn, because you are specialized in this tiny little portion of knowledge in the world, right? And when you open it up to ask, maybe you have a senior seminar of 12, maybe you have a standard size 30 student class, maybe you have hundreds of students. When you ask them what they want to learn, it is the most challenged you will ever be as an intellectual, because you have to broaden outside of your specialized knowledge to try to use all of the skills you have as a researcher and more. There are some growing pains involved to try to respond to what students are curious about, and to find a way to incorporate that into your classes. So I always leave a portion of my syllabus blank and ask students to propose, like they write formal proposals, 300 words or less, about what we're going to do on that day. What are we going to learn about, either a novel or a topic, whatever it is, or a critical question that they have using the skills in the class. And then I have to do my work as a researcher, as an intellectual, as a critical thinker, to try to find a way to respond to students. I have to turn on a dime and use every single ounce of my training to respond to that. It is the most rigorous and also the most fun challenge I've ever had as an educator. And I keep doing it again and again. And I keep growing and learning more outside of my field, and it keeps contributing to my research. that research that I do for teaching turns into research that goes into articles and papers and book chapters and things. So I'm grateful to my students for the intellectual challenges that they give me.
Thanks. So we've talked a little bit about the pushback to this whole idea that we sometimes hear from professors, but pushback can also come from students. And I want to bring in a question here from one of our attendees today, Jen Ernst, who asks, how do you get student buy-in to active learning? I've found they feel like professors who focus on it and aren't lecturing them aren't doing their job. Students seem to want a fun TED-style talk followed by a moderately challenging test. And I'll just add, we know there's research that students perceive that they learn more in a lecture, even if they, in fact, don't, right? They learn more from active learning, but that's not how they feel. So I'm curious how you would respond to John's question.
Sure, it's a great question. And we do have research that students feel that way. We also have Eric Mazur's, the person who kind of invented the flipped classroom, follow-up study, where he took MIT students who felt they were learning so much less in an active learning flipped classroom environment than from a lecture. And he had them read the most rigorous studies of actual learning, where they then were actually reading people they respected in the field, showing why active learning actually was superior in every one of the ways. Then when they were questioned on which was superior, they said active learning was better. We're talking about working against many, many years of training. And I mean, if you're at MIT, you're a winner, you're a success. You've succeeded by all the common metrics, which tend to be grades and standardized testing. So it's a rug pull when someone says, that's fine, but isn't good enough. But better that rug pull comes in college than in your first job. Because in your first job, you're fired, or you don't get a first job. Right. So what we're saying is, if we're really preparing students for the world after college, the world outside the classroom, and that's what all of our mission statements at every university says we're doing, then we have to have a method that in fact is the right method for all of the things employers are looking for, which includes independent thinking, agency, being able to collaborate, being able to share research, being able to take an idea from a bare idea, vague idea, into something rigorous that you can implement in a situation, often within boundaries. Because in a job, you never can create anything for free. You're looking for all of the different boundaries within which you create something. Those are incredible skills, and especially important for first generation students who may not have had that opportunity ever in their previous educational experiences. So these are life-saving, life-changing skills.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in addition, what I do in my classroom is I show students the studies, right? I show them the research, just like a good researcher would do. But also, I think when you're getting started out, asking colleagues who you know practice active learning, reading. I learned a lot from reading Carl Wyman's how to improve how universities teach science. For example, he has this great way of mentoring hundreds of students in physics, where at the end of an exam or an assignment, they reflect on something that they got wrong or something that they got partially wrong in the previous assignment or test, and their strategies for getting it right next time, right? Like that kind of metacognitive reflection is built in. So like learning by reading, I learned so much from reading Bettina Love, from reading Carl Wyman, John Beam, Veranda Montgomery. And so asking, depending on who your students are at your own institution, asking colleagues who practice active learning too, like what has worked with students to address some of their concerns. And how do you do it with hundreds of students? How do you do it with 12? I think explaining to students how and why it works is so important. I call it lifting up the curtains to show students the string, that it's not just magic, that we actually scaffold these things for a reason, and to go through that with students so that they understand.
And in our book, when we offer an experiment or an active learning exercise, we always include the research, because we know so many professors, especially adjuncts, scholars of color, women, people whose authority is often marginalized and questioned, need that research, because people are going to say, oh, you're just trying to get off easy. Or you really don't know, you're really not an authority figure. So we provide people with very serious, sound research to support why these things are more efficacious. And the cool thing is they're efficacious and equitable. I mean, that's hard to beat.
Thanks. I want to bring in some more audience questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but as many as we can here. Here's a question from Bree from Johns Hopkins, who wants to know, what will it take to convince faculty that ensuring students are learning is a necessary part of their work and assessment is student-centered and not just something we're doing for accreditation?
Well, 5,000 people signed up for the Chronicle Fest, so that's pretty cool. And that's, I don't just mean that flippantly. I think the pandemic made us all aware of things that sociologists of education have known for a long time, that the most famous professors, Carl Wyman, Nobel Prize winner, Eric Mazur, a Harvard professor, the most famous professors still care about teaching, right? There are lots of things you could do with your life that don't involve teaching if you just wanted to do your research. But in fact, again, sociologists of education say we spend 60% of our time in some aspect of teaching, mentoring, grading, preparing for class, something about that. That's a lot of our time. And academics work far more, sociologists of education tell us that too, far more than 40 hours a week. So we really are spending a lot of time. Why not spend it in the way that we say in our mission statements? Why not give ourselves a little more credit for how much we're doing and how much we are changing our students' lives, not just teaching specific content that we learned in graduate school or that we're researching in a given book, but in fact, these higher order things that are absolutely life-changing. Christina calls this radical optimism. And I really love this because you can't be an activist unless you have a certain, Gramsci and my mentor Stuart Hall would say you can't be an activist with some kind of optimism, but it's an act to be radically optimistic. And I think now faculty members around the country are really thinking about teaching in a different way because of this traumatic world we've all been through together.
Yeah, it's been, I think, an astonishing opportunity in the wake of the pandemic when all of a sudden, we had started working on this book when the pandemic happened. And it's just funny because we were always asking, how do we engage our students in these different types of classes and these different types of institutions all over the world? And then the world was asking and is still asking, how do we engage our students? How do we engage our students is such an important question, particularly now when we have been through so much, when everyone is tired, that I think it's radical to choose every single day to be optimistic and hopeful that we can change and that we can engage our students and that we can learn something valuable. Learning comes in fits and starts. So how you assess that learning and involving students in their own evaluation to empower them is so important to keep learning as a central goal of higher ed, right? Learning is really the goal when you come to class. And so maintaining that goal as central is so important. And it's also crucial to accreditation and all of the benchmarks we need to make.
Thanks. Another question here from Trisange from North Orange County Community College, who asks, beyond teaching and curriculum, what are some best practices for students to gain meaningful connections with faculty?
Oh, I'm in my new position in the Office of Transformation, a new office at CUNY. We're focusing one project on careers across the disciplines, and we're asking faculty to think about when they write care statements, and so many of us now write care statements, where do you go for physical health? Where do you go for mental health help? Where do you go for financial aid? Where do you go for visa help? To also put something for the career services people in, right in their syllabus and right up front, not at the back as a footnote, but right up front. We care about you and we care about your whole life. That's a very simple ask. But we know faculty have the biggest impact on students of anybody at a university. Faculty have a very powerful role. So being able to help your students in their own social and personal mobility, in their own agency, is incredibly inspiring, important, especially at community colleges, but everywhere. And that's a big initiative we're working on right now. Again, not a heavy lift. In fact, one of the things that's also great about active learning, it's not a heavy lift. In fact, many of us spend so much time on things that don't pay off, and that we're working very, very hard on things that aren't transformative instead of spending our time wisely and caring about ourselves a little bit too.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add other than building on I'm thinking about grading, for example, as an example of what Kathy's talking about. Nothing is sadder than seeing a pile of graded papers from finals left in an office unread when you have spent so much time on feedback and trying to think about student improvement for the future. And so rather than waste that time, right, trying to give formative feedback throughout the semester and involving students in their own evaluation so that they're always reading that feedback and learning an important life skill, which is how to incorporate feedback, right? How to ask for better feedback if you're not getting the feedback you need to grow, and how to learn that, yes, you can grow, right? A lot of students come to school with a fixed mindset. I'm bad at math. I'm bad at English. I'm bad at reading. I'm bad at writing, right? How do we take that, to kind of borrow from Carol Dweck's growth mindset, through feedback, through formative feedback, that no, you can learn, you can grow. That's so important. And that's time better spent than in office hours when students come to grade grubbing, or why an 83 instead of an 84, or questions like that. Instead of focusing on the grade, focusing on the learning is so important.
Thanks. I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple more questions here in the 5 minutes or so we've got left. Here's a question that gets at some of the structural issues that make this, I think, daunting for some professors. This is from Tracy Berger, who asks, are you arguing that faculty can shift to active learning without additional resources? To do it well, active learning requires smaller class sizes and good student-faculty relationships. With our current mostly adjunct workforce teaching many classes with many students, what needs to change in the current higher ed system to make active learning possible across the board?
Bottom line, this is almost an adage for the organizations we're part of. You can't make structural change. You can't make, I've forgotten my own adage. You need to change structures. Can you do it, Christina?
Yeah, you can't, you have to structure equity. You can't make equality happen with goodwill alone. You have to structure equity into a course.
Thank you, Christina.
You're welcome.
You'd think we spent the whole pandemic writing a book together. Yes, I like to say that until we change the structure of rewards and recognition, that the classroom's not going to change. Until we, at most of the institutions I've been available, I've been part of, you have these long things you fill out at the end of the year saying what papers you've given, what conferences you've gone, what articles you've written, what books you've written, what papers you've reviewed, etc. Almost nothing about teaching. Why aren't we asking the same kind of questions about teaching and making that count? That's an important change to the reward system that we need to make. And do we need more resource? Absolutely. I think this is still current, that only 2 states now fund higher education at the same rate at which they did before the 2008 collapse. Other social services have come up to the previous levels. Higher education hasn't, except in a very few cases. And my research might be, it might be a few more now since the California ruling that happened last year. But in general, we're way under-resourced. And especially adjuncts. And Christina talks so passionately and powerfully about adjuncts, especially with the role of an adjunct professor. You have to have rewards or it's not going to change. Things can't change.
Yeah, one thing in the book that we really brought to it was how can this method be used by someone who has a 45-minute commute on the train to school, and that's all the time they have for lesson planning? How can we transform that class in just like a quick read on the subway, or if you're listening to it in a podcast, or something like that? Like, how can we transform our classes when we are already stretched thin? And how can we do it in a way that our students are shouldering more of the responsibility for learning, right? The thing that they're supposed to be doing, and we're shouldering a little bit less of it, so that we have more capacity to be good mentors.
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask one final question for this discussion today. As you mentioned, you wrote this book collaborating closely, although not in person, during the intensity of the lockdown stretch of the pandemic in New York City. And yet the book really is full of optimism. And I was hoping you could share what this optimism is based in for you.
Christina, do you want to start or should I go? Why don't you go?
I think a lot of my optimism comes from students because they are the future. and thinking about the world that they want, one that's more equitable and just. So much of my optimism comes from my students, and I believe that we really can transform higher ed to meet the needs of students today, when the world is so changing so quickly, at such a rapid pace. They need to have the agency, flexibility, the leadership skills, the collaborative skills to work horizontally, to adapt, to be adaptable people. And so that gives me hope.
Yeah, I love that, Christina. And helping students see how every minute they're spending in a classroom contributes to our hope in them is so crucial. And that's kind of a pledge too. That's saying, I'm going to work really hard to make sure that what I'm doing isn't wasting my time and it isn't wasting your time. How can you not be optimistic when that's your premise, that what we're doing together is truly valuable and contributing to a better world? That's it's not naive. It's bedrock mission, why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah. I start every class asking students, how could this course change your life? What one thing could you learn in this class that you could take with you for the rest of your life? And I mean it seriously. And like, some of them might laugh or like think that I'm not being serious. And then I look at them and I'm like, no, really, what thing are you going to take from this course for the rest of your life? Tell me what you want to learn. And once they realize that I'm serious, they really start to believe that, yeah, maybe if I really put in something here and I learn what I want to learn, maybe this class could change my life, because it could. You just have to believe that it's possible.
Okay, well, thanks. On that note, Christina, Kathy, thank you both so much for your time. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'm going to move things back to my colleague Ian now.